My family insisted I keep my Labor Day weekend completely open. Just wait. My mother smiled, adjusting the collar of her designer blouse. I promise it will be a weekend you will never forget. She was absolutely right. When I woke up that Friday morning, the sprawling Atlanta estate was dead silent. By noon, I was staring at my sister Chantel's Instagram story. There they were clinking mimosas on a private jet bound for Martha's Vineyard. The caption slapped me right in the face. Best trip ever, especially since we left the dead weight at home, followed by a laughing emoji. I did not cry. I did not panic. I simply made one phone call of my own. 3 days later, my phone screen lit up with 70 missed calls and a desperate text from my mother. Please come home. We had no idea. I am Kiana, 33 years old, and until that defining weekend, I was the ultimate scapegoat of the Sterling family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain of a toxic family while secretly building your own empire. The morning began like any other humid late summer day in Atlanta. I woke up in the guest house situated just behind my parents' massive brick mansion. The guest house was small, tucked away behind the towering oak trees and the expansive swimming pool, keeping me conveniently out of sight. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stepped out onto the patio. Usually by 8 in the morning, the main house was buzzing with chaotic energy. I would normally hear my father Thomas projecting his booming pastor voice as he rehearsed his Sunday sermons, or my mother Vivian shouting orders at the landscaping crew to ensure the grounds looked perfect for her church socialite friends. But that morning the air was heavy and still. The only sound was the gentle hum of the pool filter. I walked across the manicured lawn, my bare feet damp from the morning dew, and pushed open the heavy mahogany back door of the main house. It swung open effortlessly. The silence inside was immediate and suffocating. The house felt entirely vacant. There was no smell of breakfast, no television playing in the background, no sign of life. I wandered into the grand foyer, where the vaulted ceilings echoed my footsteps. Hanging on the walls were the enormous, framed family portraits my mother insisted on updating every year. In every single picture, my younger sister Chantel stood front and center, wearing a brilliant smile, while I was always positioned in the back, slightly out of focus, dressed in colors my mother deliberately chose to wash me out. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the family group chat. For weeks, they had been dropping vague hints about a special family bonding experience. My mother had explicitly told me to cancel my weekend meetings, stressing how important it was that we all spend time together. I opened social media out of habit, and the algorithm immediately served me Chantel's latest story. The brightly lit screen illuminated the dark kitchen. The video played loudly, the sound of jet engines humming behind the upbeat music she had overlaid on the clip. I watched my father, the esteemed pastor Thomas Sterling, raise a crystal champagne flute to the camera. I watched my mother Vivian, the flawless first lady of the congregation, recline in a plush leather seat, laughing as she adjusted her expensive sunglasses. I watched Chantel pan the camera over to her husband Preston, who was grinning smugly and raising his own glass. Preston had been welcomed into our family with open arms, his mediocre tech career celebrated as genius, while my own achievements were constantly belittled. Then the text flashed across the screen in bold, white letters. Best trip ever, especially since we left the dead weight at home. I stood frozen in the center of the pristine kitchen, the video looping over and over again in the palm of my hand. The laughter from my phone felt like physical strikes against my chest. They had planned this for months. They had chartered a private flight, packed their bags in secret, and slipped away into the early morning hours without making a single sound. They had intentionally told me to clear my schedule just to ensure I would be sitting in this empty house, waiting for an invitation that was never going to come. It was a calculated, deliberate humiliation designed to remind me of my exact place in their hierarchy. For a brief moment, the ghost of the little girl who just wanted her parents to love her flared up in my chest. A decade ago, this would have broken me. I would have collapsed onto the cold marble floor, sobbing and wondering why I was never enough. I would have called my mother, begging to know what I had done wrong, apologizing for whatever imaginary slight had caused them to abandon me. I would have believed Chantel's narrative that I was a burden, a failure, a disappointment who dragged down their flawless image. But I was not that little girl anymore. The pain hit me sharp and bitter, but it evaporated almost as quickly as it arrived, replaced by a deep, absolute calm. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the dark roast bitter against my tongue, and let the silence of the massive house wash over me. The tears they probably expected to provoke did not come. Instead, my mind sharpened, focusing with crystal clarity. I had spent years quietly absorbing their disrespect, allowing them to treat me like a second-class citizen in my own family, all while I secretly built a life they could not even fathom. I walked toward the massive granite kitchen island, my eyes catching sight of a piece of paper resting perfectly in the center. It was a bright pink sticky note bearing my mother's elegant looping handwriting. The casual cruelty of the message perfectly encapsulated everything I had endured for 33 years. I set my phone down next to it, Chantel's video still playing silently on the screen, and leaned over to read the final instructions my family had left for their discarded daughter. I picked up the neon pink square of paper from the cold granite counter. My mother always loved leaving me these little love letters. I read her elegant looping handwriting out loud to the empty room. Make sure you scrub the baseboards while we are gone. Preston's parents are visiting next month, and we cannot have your mess ruining our image. My mess. I looked around the immaculate kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the recessed lighting. The pristine hardwood floors were spotless. I was a 33-year-old woman running an asset management firm that handled multi-million-dollar portfolios across the country, yet in this house I was simply the unpaid maid. I crumpled the sticky note in my fist and tossed it into the trash can. I walked out of the kitchen and into the formal dining room. The massive mahogany table was already set for 12, perfectly staged for whatever church board dinner Vivian planned to host next. She lived for this exact aesthetic. Being the first lady of my father's megachurch was not just a title to her, it was a weapon. She wielded her designer hats and tailored church suits like heavy armor, demanding absolute respect and adoration from the congregation while treating her eldest daughter like dirt beneath her expensive heels. I moved into the sunken living room, where a massive portrait of Chantel and Preston hung prominently over the fireplace. They were the golden couple. Chantel with her perfectly laid frontal and fake designer smile leaning against Preston, the supposed tech genius. When my sister brought a white tech executive home to Atlanta, my parents practically threw a parade. He was the ultimate status symbol for them, a shiny trophy that proved they had truly arrived. Preston walked around this property like he owned the very air we breathed constantly, making passive-aggressive comments about how lucky I was that my parents let me live in the guest house out back. He loved reminding me that I needed to be grateful for their charity. Grateful. I traced my finger along the edge of the custom velvet sofa my mother had demanded for her birthday last year. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. My family genuinely believed they were allowing me to take up space in their world, out of the goodness of their Christian hearts. They believed my silence over the years was submission. They thought I stayed in the guest house because I had nowhere else to go, because I was the unmarried, childless failure of a daughter who could not secure a wealthy husband like my sister did. I walked down the long hallway toward my father's study. The door was ajar. I stepped inside the room that smelled heavily of expensive cologne and old leather. This was where Pastor Thomas Sterling practiced his booming sermons about grace, humility, and family values. It was also the room where 3 years ago he sat weeping with his head in his hands because his reckless spending had finally caught up with him. He had taken out massive secret loans against the house to fund a lavish lifestyle that a pastor's salary simply could not support. The bank had sent the foreclosure notices. The church board was weeks away from finding out and stripping him of his pulpit and his prestige. I remember standing in this exact spot back then, offering to help him sort through the paperwork. He had looked at me with pure disgust, asking what a low-level property manager could possibly do to save a multi-million-dollar estate. He told me to get out of his office and go clean the guest bathroom. He never asked how I resolved the debt. He never questioned why the bank suddenly stopped calling and withdrew the foreclosure. My mother simply decided the Lord had provided a miraculous intervention, and they went right back to treating me like the help. They never knew that the miracle wore a tailored suit and ran a holding company. I left the study and walked back to the kitchen. My coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The absolute audacity of leaving me choreless while flying on a chartered jet to an island known for its exclusivity sparked a bright hot fire in my chest. My mother was obsessed with impressing Preston's parents, old money folks from Connecticut, who looked at our family with polite condescension. Vivian bent over backward to prove we belonged in their tax bracket. She bought new china, hired private chefs, and forced me to park my car on the street so their view of the driveway would not be obstructed by my daily driver. She wanted to scrub any trace of my ordinary existence from their pristine narrative. And now they were heading to Martha's Vineyard for the holiday weekend. Oak Bluffs, to be exact, the absolute pinnacle of Black elite summer vacationing. Chantel had been bragging about scoring a high-end luxury rental for months. She claimed Preston pulled some massive strings to get a beachfront estate on such short notice for the holiday weekend. She told everyone at Sunday service that her husband was treating the family to a taste of real luxury. I washed my coffee mug in the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl down the drain. I dried my hands on a monogrammed towel. I did not feel angry anymore. The constant ache of wanting my parents to look at me, the way they looked at Chantel, had finally burned itself out entirely. What remained was cold, hard clarity. They had drawn the battle lines clearly on Instagram for the entire world to see. They wanted a public display of their superiority. They wanted to show everyone that Kiana was the leftover, the afterthought, the maid left behind to clean up their messes while they lived their best lives. I turned around and walked out of the main house, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind me. I crossed the manicured lawn back to my guest house. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the grass. It was time to stop cleaning up their messes and start delivering the consequences they had been dodging for years. I crossed the damp grass back to the guest house. From the outside, my little cottage looked like an afterthought, a humble brick structure hidden behind overgrown crepe myrtles. That was exactly how Vivian wanted it. She loved pointing it out to her church friends, sighing loudly about how she graciously gave her struggling, unmarried daughter a roof over her head. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The illusion ended the second the door clicked shut. My living room was not the mismatched space my family assumed it to be. I stripped away the cheap facade years ago. The interior was sleek, soundproofed, and dominated by a custom-built home office that served as the nerve center for my entire life. I walked straight to my desk and woke up my primary monitor. I did not need to search hard to figure out where they were going. Chantel had been practically screaming the details into her phone all week while pretending to whisper. They were heading to Oak Bluffs, the crown jewel of Martha's Vineyard. It was the ultimate playground for the Black elite, a place where Vivian could parade around in linen pants and pretend she had generational wealth to match the prominent families in her congregation. Chantel had boasted to anyone who would listen that Preston pulled massive strings in the tech industry to secure a beachfront estate that usually had a 3-year waiting list. Preston loved playing the white savior who elevated our family's status. He loved taking credit for providing access to exclusive spaces, constantly reminding my parents how valuable his connections were. I typed my encrypted password into the secure portal of Obsidian Holdings. Obsidian was my brainchild. I built it from the ground up right here in this guest house while my mother yelled at me to come outside and weed her flower beds. We specialized in ultra-luxury asset management and discrete property acquisitions for high-net-worth clients. I was the founder, the sole owner, and the CEO. My family thought I was a low-level data entry clerk who occasionally balanced spreadsheets for local mom and pop shops. They actively mocked my modest wardrobe and my quiet lifestyle. They had no idea that I controlled portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars across the country. I navigated to the property management dashboard for our Northeast region. I selected the Martha's Vineyard portfolio and pulled up the booking ledger for the holiday weekend. There it was, the oceanfront grand estate in Oak Bluffs. $15,000 a night, rented under the name Preston Davis. I clicked on the payment details and a cold smile touched my lips. Preston had not used his own money. He had not used his supposed tech executive corporate card. The booking was charged directly to the Sterling Family Trust. The Sterling Family Trust was a masterclass in financial delusion. 3 years ago, when the church board nearly audited my father for his reckless spending, I quietly established that trust through a blind shell company. I funneled my own capital into it to keep my parents from drowning in debt and dragging our family name through the mud. My father Thomas, with his boundless arrogance, simply believed his fervent prayers had manifested an anonymous wealthy benefactor. He never questioned the source. He just kept buying expensive suits and funding Chantel's fake influencer lifestyle. And apparently, he was allowing his entitled dead-broke white son-in-law to use my money to fund their luxury vacations so Preston could take the credit. I clicked on the property deed information attached to the booking file. The screen populated with the legal ownership data. Owner of Record Obsidian Holdings, CEO Kiana Sterling. They were flying on a chartered jet paid for by my hidden funds to sleep in a multi-million-dollar beachfront mansion that I personally owned. They left me chore lists to scrub their baseboards while they lived like royalty on my dime. The sheer disrespect was staggering, but it was also their fatal mistake. When you rely on someone else's foundation to prop up your fake lifestyle, you should never kick the pillar holding you up. They had pushed me aside for the last time, and I was finally ready to pull the rug out from under their entire reality. I picked up my phone and scrolled to my contacts. I tapped the number for David, my lead property manager on the vineyard. He answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Miss Sterling," David said, his voice bright and professional. "We have the Oak Bluffs property fully prepped for the incoming guests. The private chef is on standby, and the welcome baskets are arranged in the foyer." "Good morning, David," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "There has been a change of plans. I need you to pull the chef and remove the welcome amenities immediately." David did not miss a beat. "Understood. Should I prepare the property for a different arrival time?" "No," I said, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and staring at the booking profile on my screen. "I want you to void the current reservation. The payment method linked to the booking is flagged. You are going to cancel the Sterling family reservation right now, mark it as a fraudulent booking in the system. Then I need you to clear the staff off the grounds and lock the main gates. Nobody gets onto that property today." I ended the call with David and set my phone face down on the cool granite counter. The massive house around me was still dead quiet, but the digital world was just waking up. I walked back into my hidden home office, woke up my monitors, and settled into my leather chair. On my left screen, I pulled up the high-definition live security feed for the Oak Bluffs estate. On my right screen, I opened Chantel's Instagram page. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and leaned back. The waiting game was always the most delicious part. Right on cue, the little purple ring illuminated around Chantel's profile picture. She was broadcasting live. I clicked the icon, and the screen filled with my sister's perfectly contoured face. The ocean breeze was whipping her silk scarf around her shoulders. She was holding the camera high to capture the sweeping coastal views as their black Cadillac Escalade cruised down the winding Martha's Vineyard roads. "Hey, y'all!" Chantel cooed into the camera, her voice dripping with that fake, breathless excitement she used strictly for her followers. "We just landed and we are heading to the estate. Preston pulled some major strings to get us this gorgeous beachfront property. Generational wealth, baby. You have to claim your blessings." Through the phone speaker, I could hear my mother Vivian chiming in from the back seat. "Praise the Lord," she hummed clearly, making sure her oversized designer sunglasses and pristine church hat were in frame. "When you walk in His favor, He opens doors that no man can shut." I let out a dry, sharp laugh in my empty kitchen. The irony was almost too heavy to carry. The only doors opening for them today were the doors of that rental SUV, and I was exactly the woman about to shut them. On my left monitor, the security cameras covering the Oak Bluffs driveway flickered. A sleek black Escalade pulled into the frame tires, crunching against the crushed white gravel. On my right monitor, Chantel flipped her camera to show the approach to her audience. "And here we are," she squealed. The camera panned up to reveal the massive wrought iron gates of the estate. But instead of sliding open to welcome the Golden family, the gates stood completely immobile. They were wrapped in a thick, heavy steel chain secured with a solid brass padlock. Standing squarely in front of those locked gates were two of David's best private security guards. They were tall, broad-shouldered black men, wearing sharp black suits and earpieces, looking like they had been carved directly from stone. They did not move an inch as the escalade rolled to a halt. Chantel's live stream captured the exact moment her performative smile faltered. "Oh wait," she said to her viewers, trying desperately to keep her tone light and breezy. "Looks like they take security super seriously here. Preston babe, tell them to let us in." Preston put the SUV in park and rolled down his window. Through the security feed audio, I could hear his voice carrying crisp and clear over the ocean wind. He was using that specific tone of voice, the one steeped in generations of unchecked white privilege, fully expecting these black men to jump at his command. "Hey guys," Preston shouted, slapping on his best entitled tech bro smile. "Preston Davis, we have the property booked for the weekend. You can go ahead and open up." The lead guard, a man named Marcus, who had been working for my firm for 3 years, stepped forward. His expression was completely blank. He pulled a tablet from his jacket pocket, tapped the screen once, and looked back at Preston. "I have no active reservation for a Preston Davis," Marcus stated, his voice a deep, unbothered baritone. "This property is closed to the public. I need you to clear the driveway." On the Instagram live feed, the comment section started scrolling faster. Chantel's followers were noticing the tension. Chantel quickly pointed the camera away from the window and back to her own face, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "Just a little mix-up at the gate, y'all. VIP problems." She laughed nervously, her voice pitching up an octave. "Let me hop off here and get this sorted. Bye." The live feed abruptly ended. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk, my eyes glued to the security camera feed. This was where the real show started. Preston shoved his door open and stepped out of the vehicle, his face flushing a bright, angry red. He puffed out his chest, marching right up to the gates, as if his sheer proximity would intimidate a man twice his size. My father Thomas also climbed out of the passenger side, aggressively buttoning his tailored linen jacket, ready to bring his booming pastoral authority into the mix. "Listen to me," Preston snapped, pointing a finger through the iron bars directly at Marcus. "I do not think you understand who you are dealing with. I am an elite executive and I paid $15,000 a night for this rental. My card has already been charged. You are going to take that chain off the gate right now, or I am going to sue this management company into the ground and have your job." Marcus did not even blink. He did not take a single step back. He simply looked at Preston's pointing finger, then up to Preston's sweating red face. "Sir, I do not work for whatever booking agency you think you used," Marcus said calmly. "I work directly for the owner of this estate, and the owner has flagged your reservation as fraudulent." Fraudulent, Thomas roared, stepping up beside his son-in-law. "Now see here, young man. I am Pastor Thomas Sterling of the Greater Heights Ministries. We are respectable people, walking in the light of the Lord. You are making a terrible, highly actionable mistake." My mother rolled down her window from the back seat, her perfectly glossed lips pulled into a tight snarl. "Thomas, do not argue with the help. Just call the concierge service and have them fired. We have prominent guests arriving for a cocktail hour at sunset, and we cannot have this foolishness delaying my caterers." I watched the entire exchange from the quiet comfort of my hidden office. The absolute audacity of my mother calling my staff the help while she was currently sitting on the wrong side of a locked gate in a rented car was sheer poetry. Preston was furiously tapping on his phone, trying to pull up the confirmation email, cursing under his breath as the service failed to load. Thomas was pacing the driveway, waving his arms and talking loudly about respect and dignity, demanding to speak to the owner immediately. They were throwing every bit of weight they thought they had against a wall that would never move. Marcus stood his ground, a towering wall of calm against their escalating hysteria. He waited for Preston to stop yelling. He waited for Thomas to finish his loud sermon on the driveway. Then he reached into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He did not dial a number. The call was already connected. He simply tapped the speaker icon and held the phone out through the iron bars directly toward Preston's chest. "You want to speak to the owner?" Marcus said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the sound of the crashing waves. "She is on the line." Preston stared at the sleek black device resting in Marcus's outstretched palm. Through my left monitor, I watched the gears turning behind his flushed face. He was trying to process how the sister-in-law he treated like a peasant had somehow intercepted his confrontation at a luxury estate in Massachusetts. He snatched the phone from Marcus's hand, his knuckles white with rage. I did not give him a chance to speak first. "Hello, Preston," I said, leaning closer to the microphone on my desk. "I hope the flight was comfortable. I heard the catering on that specific jet is usually quite good, though I do prefer the Gulfstream myself." Preston let out a harsh, incredulous breath that crackled over the speaker. "Kiana, what is this? Did you get a job as a customer service rep for the management company? Listen to me very carefully. You are going to tell this rent-a-cop to open the gate, or I will personally make sure you are fired by the end of the hour. I paid for this rental." His voice echoed across the crushed gravel driveway, carrying straight through the open windows of the Escalade where my parents and sister were sitting. He was putting on a show for them, reinforcing his role as the wealthy, commanding patriarch of the trip. "You did not pay for anything, Preston," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly level. "And Marcus is not a rent-a-cop. He is an elite security contractor employed by Obsidian Holdings. That is my company, Preston. I am the founder and the chief executive officer. I own the agency you booked through, and more importantly, I own the estate sitting right behind those iron gates." There was a split second of absolute silence on the feed. Even the ocean breeze seemed to hold its breath. Preston blinked, his brow furrowing as his brain rejected the information. "That is a pathetic lie," Preston scoffed, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. "You live in a guest house. You do not own a multi-million-dollar property in Oak Bluffs. Stop playing games and open the gate before I call the police." I smiled, taking a sip of my coffee. "Go ahead and call them. The local authorities are very familiar with my security team. But before you dial, let us talk about your payment method. You told my sister you were treating the family to a taste of real luxury. You bragged to my father about your elite tech money. But when you tried to process the $15,000 a night deposit yesterday, your card declined." Through the security camera, I saw Chantel physically lean out of the rear window of the SUV. "Preston, what is she talking about?" Chantel demanded, her voice sharp with sudden panic. Preston spun around, turning his back to the car to shield the phone completely, forgetting that Marcus still had the device locked on speaker mode. "It is a banking error," Chantel. Preston snapped over his shoulder. "Just a hold on the account because we are traveling." He turned back to the phone, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You are breaching client confidentiality, Kiana. I am going to destroy you in court for this." "You cannot afford a lawyer, Preston," I stated, dropping the temperature of my voice until it was ice cold. "Your card did not decline because of a travel hold. It declined because it is linked directly to the Sterling Family Trust. You have been secretly siphoning money from my parents' account for 6 months to fund your lifestyle." "Liar," Preston shouted, stepping aggressively toward the camera lens. "My company is highly profitable. Your company went bankrupt in February." I fired back, raising my voice just enough to ensure every single person in that car heard me clearly. "You lost your seed funding, you missed your product launch, and your primary investors pulled out. You have not drawn a legitimate salary in over half a year. You have been paying for your leased sports car, your country club membership, and your designer watches using the family trust. The same trust you linked to this vacation rental to impress a family you secretly despise." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Through the high-definition feed, I watched Preston's entire posture collapse. His broad, aggressive shoulders slumped. The arrogant tilt of his chin vanished. He looked back at the Escalade where Chantel was staring at him with her mouth hanging wide open. My mother had taken off her designer sunglasses, her eyes darting frantically between her white savior son-in-law and the locked gates. Preston turned back to the phone, his voice dropping to a desperate, shaking whisper that the microphone still picked up perfectly. "Kiana, please, turn off the speaker. We can talk about this privately. Do not do this to me in front of them." "You did not want privacy when you posted about leaving the dead weight at home," I reminded him. "You wanted an audience. You wanted a public spectacle. Well, you have one now." I leaned back in my chair, watching him sweat. Preston had built his entire identity in our family on his supposed superiority. He used his race and his fabricated wealth to command respect from my parents, who were all too eager to bow down to him. He treated me like a peasant because it made him feel like a king. Now standing on the wrong side of my property line, his crown was entirely shattered. How did you even stop the payment? Preston stammered, his hands shaking as he raked them through his expensive haircut. Even if I use the trust, you do not have access to those accounts. Thomas controls the trust. I let out a slow, dark laugh. Thomas does not control anything. He is simply the beneficiary on paper. I am the sole financier of the Sterling Family Trust. I created it. I funded it. And 10 minutes ago, I legally froze it. Your accounts are locked, Preston. Your credit cards are dead plastic. You are standing on an island known for extreme wealth, and you do not have a single dime to your name. Preston looked like he was going to vomit. He stumbled backward away from the gate and away from Marcus, who had not moved a single muscle during the entire exchange. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He had no money, no place to stay, and his entire web of lies had just been broadcast to the family he had been scamming. Chantel pushed her car door open and stepped out onto the gravel. Her designer heels crunched loudly in the quiet afternoon air. Preston, she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you paid for this trip. Tell me you have money. Preston could not even look her in the eye. He stared down at his expensive Italian loafers, completely mute. His silence was the loudest confession possible. From the passenger seat of the SUV, a new figure emerged. My father, Thomas, stepped out onto the driveway. His face was a mask of righteous fury, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping under his skin. He marched past a sobbing Chantel and a broken Preston, walking directly up to Marcus. He did not look at the security guard. He glared straight into the phone's camera, knowing I was watching him from hundreds of miles away. He snatched the phone directly out of Marcus's hand. Now you listen to me, Thomas boomed, his voice vibrating with the practiced heavy wrath of a megachurch pastor who was used to absolute obedience. The transition of power had shifted from the entitled son-in-law to the furious patriarch, but the result was going to be exactly the same. They were standing outside my castle and I held the only key. Kiana Renee Sterling. My father boomed into the phone, his voice vibrating with the practiced cadence of a man who commanded thousands of people every Sunday. I do not know what kind of demonic rebellious spirit has taken root in your heart this morning, but you are going to bind it and cast it out right now. I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Through the high-definition security feed on my monitor, I watched him puff out his chest. He was wearing a tailored linen suit that probably cost more than the average tithe at his church. He was trying to use his physical presence to intimidate a camera lens, projecting his pastoral authority all the way from Massachusetts down to my hidden office in Atlanta. You are going to instruct this man to open these gates. Thomas continued, his tone shifting from a shout to that dangerously quiet rumble he used when he wanted to strike fear into his congregation. You are going to apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law for this humiliating display. And when I return to Atlanta, we are going to have a very serious conversation about your place in my family. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk, letting him dig the hole exactly as deep as he wanted it. You live under my roof, he declared, pointing a thick finger at the phone in Marcus's hand. You eat the food I provide. I have graciously allowed you to occupy that guest house because you could not secure a proper husband to provide for you. I put that roof over your head. You owe me absolute respect. If you do not open these gates this very second, I will have your belongings thrown out onto the street before my flight touches down back home. Do not test me, Kiana. I am the head of this household. The silence that followed was absolute. On the security feed, I saw my mother Vivian nodding along with him from the back seat of the Escalade, her face arranged in a mask of righteous indignation. She loved it when Thomas played the heavy-handed patriarch. Chantel was still wiping mascara tears from her cheeks, looking at our father like he was a superhero swooping in to slay the wicked villain. They all actually believed he had the power to crush me. I set my coffee mug down on the desk. The soft clink echoed in my quiet, soundproofed sanctuary. Are you finished, Thomas? I asked. My voice was perfectly flat, devoid of a single ounce of the fear he was expecting. I do not call him Dad. I have not called him Dad in a very long time. He let out a sharp, offended breath. Excuse me. I said, "Are you finished making threats with things you do not own?" I leaned closer to the microphone. "You just spent 2 solid minutes screaming about the roof you put over my head. You threatened to throw me out of my guest house. You commanded me to respect your property. Let us talk about that property, Thomas. Let us talk about exactly who owns the roof over our heads." On the screen, Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as he glanced back at Vivian. He was confused. The script in his head dictated that I should be crying and apologizing by now. 3 years ago, I continued, my voice sharp and clinical. You locked yourself in your study for a week. You told Vivian you were fasting and praying for the church, but that was a lie. You were hiding. You were hiding because you had taken out 4 massive secret loans against the Atlanta estate to fund your luxury cars, Vivian's designer wardrobe, and the exorbitant wedding you threw for Chantel. And then the grace period ended. The bank sent the foreclosure notices. Through the security feed, I watched the blood completely drain from my father's face. His mouth fell slightly open. Behind him, Vivian physically recoiled, her hand flying up to cover her chest. "You were absolutely terrified," I said, driving the truth forward like a blade. "You knew if the church board found out their esteemed pastor had bankrupted his own family, they would strip you of your pulpit, your salary, and your social standing. You would have been a laughingstock. You were weeks away from being thrown out onto the street. And then, miraculously, an anonymous investment group called Vanguard Holdings swooped in, bought the debt, paid off the bank, and allowed you to stay in the home under a quiet private trust." Thomas was gripping the iron bars of the gate, now his knuckles turning white. His eyes were wide, staring into the camera lens with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "You went to church that next Sunday and preached a 2-hour sermon on divine intervention," I said, my voice dripping with cold amusement. "You told the congregation that God had sent an angel to protect your generational wealth. You never bothered to look into who owned Vanguard Holdings. You never read the fine print on the transition documents you frantically signed. If you had, you would have seen the parent company listed at the very bottom of page 47. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, letting the ocean wind howl through the speaker. "Obsidian Holdings," I stated clearly. "I am the Angel Thomas. I bought the debt. I bought the foreclosure. I bought the entire estate." On the feed, Preston looked like he was going to pass out. Chantel was shaking her head back and forth, muttering the word "no" over and over again. Vivian looked like she had just been struck by lightning. "You have been living in my house for 3 years," I told him, dropping every ounce of polite restraint. "I let you stay there rent-free to save you from absolute public ruin. And how did you repay me? You let your wife leave me chore lists on my own granite countertops. You let your fake influencer daughter and her broke husband disrespect me in my own home. You told me to scrub your baseboards while you chartered private jets on my dime." Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The booming, charismatic megachurch pastor had completely lost his voice. He looked small. He looked weak. He looked exactly like the fraud he was. "So please, Thomas," I said, my tone shifting to pure ice. "Tell me again how you are going to throw my belongings out onto the street. Tell me again how I need to respect the head of the household. Because from where I am sitting, the actual head of the household is looking at a grown man throwing a temper tantrum on a gravel driveway." "Kiana, please," Vivian suddenly shrieked from the back of the SUV, her pristine image entirely shattered. "Kiana, we did not know. We are your family." "You lost the right to use that word when you boarded that plane," I replied. "I am done playing the quiet maid. I am done protecting your secrets. I am done funding your delusions." I looked at the security feed, watching the 4 of them standing frozen in the Martha's Vineyard sunshine. They were surrounded by luxury, yet completely destitute. "Marcus," I said through the phone. "Yes, Miss Sterling," Marcus replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact with my father. "The guests are no longer welcome on the premises," I instructed. "Ensure they vacate the private drive immediately. If they refuse, contact the local authorities for trespassing." "Understood," Marcus said. I looked at my family one last time through the digital lens. "Enjoy the curb, Thomas. I hear the airport terminal has plenty of comfortable chairs for you to sleep in." I reached forward and clicked the disconnect button. The audio feed cut out instantly. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the silent video feed. Marcus calmly pulled his phone away, slipped it back into his tailored jacket, and pointed a firm gloved hand back up the driveway toward the main road. Thomas did not argue. He did not scream. He simply turned around, his shoulders completely slumped, and walked back to the rented SUV like a man marching to the gallows. Preston climbed into the driver's seat, moving like a zombie. Chantel slammed her door shut, hiding her face in her hands. The brake lights illuminated, and the black Escalade slowly reversed down the long, crushed gravel driveway, backing away from the iron gates of my property. I watched the vehicle disappear around the bend, leaving nothing but empty space and locked gates behind. I picked up my coffee mug and took a long, satisfying sip. The Labor Day weekend had only just begun. Labor Day weekend in Martha's Vineyard means absolute gridlock. Every boutique hotel, every bed and breakfast, and every cheap roadside motel is booked solid a full year in advance. Even if they could somehow find a miraculous cancellation, the holiday rates would be astronomical. Preston had no access to the family trust, meaning his available credit limit was practically zero. They had no choice but to abandon the island entirely. I sat in my quiet, climate-controlled office and watched the GPS tracker on their rental SUV slowly crawl toward the ferry terminal. They were retreating to the mainland, destined for Boston Logan International Airport. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and simply waited. It took exactly 4 hours for the pressure to break. Chantel. My right monitor lit up with a notification. Chantel was live on Instagram. I clicked the glowing purple ring around her profile picture and expanded the video to full screen. The visual contrast was stunning. Hours earlier, she had been broadcasting from the back of a luxury vehicle, boasting about generational wealth with the ocean breeze in her hair. Now she was sitting cross-legged on a stained, patterned carpet. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a commercial airport terminal completely washed out her complexion. Her perfect lace front wig was visibly lifting at the edges from sweat, and her expensive waterproof mascara was running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She held the camera uncomfortably close to her face, sniffing loudly into the microphone. "Hey, everybody!" Chantel sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured victimhood. "I just wanted to get on here and warn all my followers. You really have to be careful who you trust in the luxury travel space. We booked a $15,000 a night estate in Oak Bluffs, and it was a complete scam. The management agency took our money and locked us out of the property. It was a pathetic attempt at damage control. She was desperately trying to spin their eviction into a sympathetic narrative. She wanted her thousands of followers to view her as a wealthy victim of corporate fraud, rather than a broke woman who had just been legally locked out by the sister she publicly mocked. But the background of her video told the real story. Behind Chantel, Preston was slumped against a trash can next to a public charging station. His tailored linen shirt was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He was frantically jabbing at his phone screen, trying to reach any bank, any friend, or any investor who would answer his calls. The arrogant, entitled white tech executive who had threatened to sue my security team hours earlier was now reduced to sitting on a dirty airport floor, completely powerless and entirely broke. But the true masterpiece of the broadcast was Vivian. The camera shifted slightly as Chantel wiped her nose, revealing my mother stretched out across 3 uncomfortable metal waiting chairs. Vivian, the flawless First Lady of Greater Heights Ministries, a woman who demanded that I park my car on the street so I would not ruin the aesthetic of her driveway, was using her prized Louis Vuitton tote bag as a makeshift pillow. Her immaculate church hat was crushed against the metal armrest. Her silk scarf was tangled around her neck. She looked disheveled, exhausted, and utterly miserable. The comments on the live stream were flying across the screen at lightning speed. Chantel had cultivated a massive following, and a significant portion of that audience consisted of members from my father's megachurch. They tuned in expecting to see ocean views, private chefs, and high society glamour. Instead, they were watching their esteemed pastoral family camping out at a commercial airport gate like stranded backpackers. My secondary phone rang. It was the dedicated line I kept for church administration purposes. The caller ID displayed the name of Sister Patterson. She was the head of the usher board and the undisputed queen of congregation gossip. If you wanted a secret buried forever, you took it to the grave. If you wanted a secret broadcast to 3,000 congregants before Sunday morning service, you told Sister Patterson. This was the exact same woman who used to pull me aside after service to tell me my sensible work suits were too plain, aggressively suggesting I take fashion advice from my glamorous younger sister. She had spent years treating me like the unfortunate frumpy backup child while worshipping the ground Vivian walked on. Now she was calling me for the inside scoop on her idol's public humiliation. I answered the call on the first ring. "Hello, Sister Patterson," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly professional. "Kiana, baby, are you seeing this right now?" Sister Patterson gasped, her voice practically vibrating with scandalous delight. "I am watching Chantel's live video on the internet. Is your mother sleeping on the floor of Boston Logan Airport? What on earth is going on up there? Did Pastor Thomas lose his wallet?" It appears there has been a severe financial misunderstanding regarding their holiday trip. "Sister Patterson," I replied, choosing my words with clinical precision. Preston was entirely in charge of the finances, and things did not go as planned at all. Please keep my parents in your prayers tonight. They are going through a very difficult and humbling season right now. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Sister Patterson breathed heavily into the receiver. "I am starting a prayer chain right this minute. Bless their hearts." I hung up the phone and smiled. I knew exactly what that meant. A prayer chain initiated by Sister Patterson was essentially a mass text message to every busybody in the tri-state area. Within 20 minutes, the entire congregation of Greater Heights Ministries would know that Pastor Thomas and First Lady Vivian were broke and stranded at an airport because their wealthy white son-in-law was actually a total fraud. I turned my attention back to the monitor, just in time to watch the live stream implode. Vivian had finally woken up from her uncomfortable nap and realized her tearful daughter was broadcasting their misery to the entire internet. "Chantel, what are you doing?" Vivian shrieked. Her voice was shrill and panicked as she scrambled up from the metal chairs, completely abandoning her refined persona. "Are you filming this? Turn that camera off right now. Do you know who is watching this?" Vivian lunged toward the lens, her manicured hand swatting aggressively at the phone. The screen blurred into a chaotic, dizzying spin of airport ceiling tiles and speckled carpet before abruptly going black. The broadcast ended. I sat back and took a deep breath, letting the silence of my hidden office wrap around me. Vivian had spent my entire life carefully curating her image. She traded her maternal instincts for social climbing long before I was even a teenager. She made me scrub baseboards and clean guest bathrooms, just so she could play the role of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch for her congregation. And in less than 10 minutes, her golden child had accidentally shattered that pristine image into a million irreparable pieces. The congregation saw the truth. The facade was cracking wide open for everyone to see. But public humiliation was only the beginning of their problems. Sleeping in an airport terminal is free, but eventually you have to buy a ticket home. You have to eat. You have to survive. Preston had no access to credit. Chantel spent every dime she ever made on designer clothes to maintain her fake aesthetic. Vivian relied entirely on the joint accounts linked to the frozen trust. That left Thomas. I knew my father better than anyone. He was a man with a massive ego who refused to be publicly embarrassed or inconvenienced for long. If his personal accounts were frozen by my actions, there was only one other place a desperate megachurch pastor could go to find immediate substantial cash. He was going to try and dip into the church funds. He was going to try and steal from his own congregation to buy his family a hotel room and a flight back to Atlanta. What he did not know was that I had already built an impenetrable wall around that money too. The screen went black when the live feed cut out, but the digital shockwave was already moving. I sat in my quiet office, the glow of my monitors reflecting off the glass desk. My family was stranded in a terminal at Boston, Logan humiliated and exhausted. But humiliation does not buy a plane ticket home. Sleeping on an airport floor is free, but eventually you have to feed yourself. You have to escape. Preston's credit was completely dead. Chantel spent every dime she earned on designer bags to maintain her fake internet aesthetic. Vivian's personal accounts were tied to the trust I had just frozen. That left Thomas. I knew exactly what my father was doing in that moment. I knew it because my secondary monitor was currently displaying the secure banking portal for the Greater Heights Ministries Community Development Fund. My father was a man who believed his title granted him absolute immunity from the rules that governed ordinary people. He had a predictable pattern when backed into a financial corner. He would dip into the church's emergency reserves, moving money around like a shell game, always convincing himself it was just a temporary pastoral loan. 3 years ago, when the neighborhood surrounding our church was struggling with gentrification and rising housing costs, I established the Community Development Fund. I seeded it with $2 million of my own money to provide rental assistance, after-school programs, and grocery stipends for single mothers in our congregation. Because I knew my father's ego could never handle his daughter being the savior of his community, I routed the money through a blind charitable trust managed by Obsidian Philanthropy. Thomas spent the last 3 years bragging from the pulpit about the wealthy anonymous angel investor God had sent directly to his ministry. He used the fund's existence to elevate his own status, taking the credit for every scholarship and every community grant distributed. What he did not know was that as the sole benefactor, I retained absolute legal oversight of every single transaction. I received an alert for every withdrawal over $500. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly watching him abuse that money. Right on cue, a bright red notification popped up on my screen. A wire transfer request had been initiated from an IP address, pinging directly from the airport's public network. The request was for $12,000. The routing destination was a commercial airline purchasing portal. He was trying to buy 4 last-minute first-class tickets back to Atlanta using the money meant for the community food bank. I moved my mouse over the red notification. I did not just hit decline. I engaged the complete audit protocol I had prepared weeks ago. By legally freezing the development fund, I triggered an automatic lock on all connected church operating accounts to prevent cross-contamination of charitable assets. Every single financial artery keeping Greater Heights Ministries alive was instantly paralyzed. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to Deacon Rollins, the elderly, no-nonsense church treasurer who handled the daily ledgers. He answered with a frazzled, out-of-breath greeting. "Kiana, praise the Lord, you called." Deacon Rollins said, his voice laced with panic. "I am trying to reach your father, but it goes straight to voicemail. The bank just called me. The anonymous trust just initiated a total freeze. Every account is locked. The payroll for the church staff is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and I cannot move a single dime." I kept my voice perfectly calm and soothing. "Take a deep breath, Deacon Rollins. The benefactor initiated a routine security audit due to some irregular spending patterns. There is nothing for you to worry about. You have kept meticulous ledgers. But Pastor Thomas is the only one with the emergency override authorization," he pleaded. "We have utility bills bouncing." "I will handle Pastor Thomas, I promised. Do not attempt to bypass the freeze. The auditors will be in touch with the board by Monday morning." I hung up the phone and waited. It took exactly 3 minutes for my private business line to ring. It was a restricted number, but I knew who was on the other end. Thomas had undoubtedly called the bank in a panic, screaming at whatever poor customer service representative answered the phone, only to be told he needed to contact the benefactor's legal liaison directly. I pressed the answer button and put the phone on speaker. "This is Pastor Thomas Sterling of Greater Heights Ministries." My father barked immediately. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual smooth, rhythmic charm. "I demand to speak to the account manager for the community trust. There has been a catastrophic banking error, and my church accounts are being held hostage. I have emergency travel expenses that need to be cleared immediately." "It is not a banking error, Thomas," I said. The silence that blasted through the speaker was absolute. I could hear the faint echoing announcements of the airport terminal in the background. I could hear his heavy, ragged breathing. "Kiana," he whispered, the sound dripping with genuine confusion. "Why are you answering this number? Did you hack the bank? This is a federal crime. I will have you arrested." I let out a slow, dry laugh. "You are projecting again. I did not hack anything. I am the anonymous benefactor. I am the angel investor you have been bragging about for 3 years. I funded the community center. I paid for the youth programs. And I am the one who just locked you out of the vault. That is impossible, he stammered, his voice rising in panic. You do not have that kind of capital. You are a property manager. I am the chief executive officer of Obsidian Holdings. I corrected him sharply. I manage assets for billionaires, Thomas. And I used my own profits to keep your church afloat because I actually care about the community you use as a prop. But I am not going to let you steal from single mothers to buy yourself a first-class ticket out of the mess you created. I am the pastor of that church, he roared, completely losing his composure. The people around him in the terminal were probably staring, but he was too desperate to care. That money was given to my ministry. It is mine to manage as I see fit under the guidance of the Lord. You have no right to question my pastoral discretion. Pastoral discretion. I echoed, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register. Is that what you call the $4,000 invoice I saw last month for custom-tailored suits logged under youth outreach expenses? Is that what you call the lavish dinners at steakhouses with your golf buddies expensed as pastoral counseling? He did not answer. His breathing grew faster, hitching with sheer panic. I have the receipts for everything. I continued, tightening the trap. But the real reason I triggered the financial audit today was the $30,000 wire transfer you authorized back in February. You pulled 30 grand directly from the Community Housing Relief Fund and wired it to a failing tech startup in California, a startup owned by your precious entitled son-in-law. You stole from the poor to fund Preston's failing vanity project because you were so desperate to keep a white tech executive in the family to boost your social status. Kiana, please, my father begged, his booming voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You do not understand business. Preston was going to give the church a massive return on investment when his app launched. It was a bridge loan. If the board sees that audit, they will expel me. I will lose my pension. I will lose everything. You cannot do this to your own father. Open the account so I can get us a hotel room. We are sleeping on the floor. You should be used to sleeping on a foundation of lies, I replied coldly. The audit is already in motion. The church board will have the full report by Monday. You cannot buy a hotel room, Thomas, because the money does not belong to you. And quite frankly, neither does the church anymore. I reached forward to end the call, but his frantic, desperate shouting stopped my hand. Wait, please, he yelled into the phone, the sound of a man watching his entire legacy burn to ash. Preston told me the company was just going through a restructuring. He said the $30,000 would save the launch. He promised me he would pay it back with interest by July. He lied to me. I leaned into the microphone, smiling at the sound of the Golden family turning on each other. Then I suggest you turn around and ask your brilliant son-in-law where your money went, I said. Because Preston does not have a company anymore, and he certainly does not have a way to fly you home. I ended the call, disconnecting the line completely. The financial walls had completely closed in. Thomas was trapped in a commercial airport with his disgraced wife, his fake influencer daughter, and the broke son-in-law, who had just scammed him out of stolen church funds. The implosion was about to reach its absolute peak. I disconnected the call and set my phone face down on the glass desk. The sudden quiet in my hidden office felt completely triumphant. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a trace of guilt. For the next 3 days, I simply let them sit in the mess they created. I closed my encrypted laptop, packed a small overnight bag, and left the guest house behind. I drove straight to my actual residence. My family fully believed my entire existence was confined to that cramped brick cottage in their backyard. They loved the narrative of the struggling, unmarried Black woman who needed their Christian charity just to survive. They never knew that for the past 2 years, I only slept in that guest house to keep a watchful eye on the estate I secretly owned. The rest of the time, I lived exactly where I belonged, high above the city. My downtown Atlanta penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline. The floors were imported dark hardwood, and the art on the walls was curated and original. I spent the holiday weekend lounging on my custom velvet sofa, sipping expensive matcha lattes, and monitoring their absolute destruction through the digital grapevine. 3 days in a commercial airport terminal will strip the arrogance off anybody, but watching it happen to my family was an entirely new level of poetry. Chantel tried to maintain her influencer facade for the first 24 hours. She posted tightly cropped selfies near the duty-free shops, claiming they were dealing with a minor VIP travel delay. But the internet is ruthless. Her followers had already seen the catastrophic live stream. People were taking screenshots and making videos mocking her fake generational wealth. Social media got hold of the footage, and within hours, Chantel was a trending topic for all the wrong reasons. By day 2, Chantel went completely dark online. The pristine, glamorous golden child was reduced to crying in a public restroom while trying to wash her face with harsh airport soap. Vivian fared even worse. The First Lady of Greater Heights Ministries was accustomed to luxury deference and absolute comfort. Sleeping across metal chairs with her designer coat bunched up as a pillow completely shattered her spirit. I knew from the frantic voicemails Thomas left on my blocked secondary line that Vivian was having full-blown panic attacks near the food court. She was terrified that members of their congregation would walk past and see her looking like a common vagrant. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being better than everyone else. And now she was begging airline attendants for meal vouchers. But the true collapse happened on day 3. The tension of being broke, hungry, and stranded finally broke Preston. Thomas had cornered him near a public charging station. According to the furious, breathless voicemails, Thomas left me demanding I unlock the accounts my father had ordered Preston to call his wealthy Connecticut parents for a bailout. Thomas demanded Preston use his massive corporate tech accounts to charter a flight home. Preston could not hide behind his white savior tech bro persona any longer. His privilege could not swipe a declined credit card. He cracked right there at gate B22. He broke down and confessed everything to my parents. Horizon Tech Solutions did not just hit a minor restructuring bump. The company went completely bankrupt 6 months ago. His primary investors discovered he was mismanaging funds and pulled out entirely. They seized his intellectual property. Preston had zero income, zero assets, and zero prospects. He had been maintaining his country club memberships, leasing his matte black Porsche, and buying Chantel designer gifts. Using the monthly stipends Thomas secretly funneled to him from the church community fund. The sheer irony of the situation was almost suffocating. Thomas and Vivian had been financing Preston's elite lifestyle using money that I was silently donating to keep their church afloat. It was a magnificent circle of financial delusion. Vivian thought she had secured a billionaire son-in-law who elevated their social standing. Thomas thought he was investing church funds into the next big application that would multiply his wealth. Preston thought he had tapped into endless megachurch pockets. None of them knew they were all just passing around my spare change. When Preston confessed, the reality hit Thomas and Vivian like a physical blow. Their perfect wealthy son-in-law was a broke fraud living off their stolen money. But the absolute devastation came just a few hours later, when the banking systems updated after the holiday weekend. Because I froze the Sterling Family Trust and locked every single church operating account, the automatic payments scheduled for the first of the month bounced completely. The mortgage payment for the Atlanta estate failed to process. The bank sent an immediate automated default notice directly to Thomas's email. I was sitting in my penthouse living room, watching the sunset paint the Atlanta skyline in shades of deep orange and violet. The jazz music playing softly from my sound system was the only noise in the room. Then my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the glass coffee table. It vibrated again and again. I picked it up and watched the screen light up with a relentless stream of notifications. 70 missed calls. They were calling from Chantel's phone, from Preston's phone, from a random airport payphone. The desperation was bleeding through the screen. My father had lost his funding. My sister had lost her fake wealth. My mother had lost her pristine image. And now they were realizing they were about to lose the very roof over their heads. I swiped away the missed call notifications and watched a text message push through. It was from Vivian. I could practically hear the hysterical sobbing in the words she typed. Please come home. We didn't know. The bank is seizing the house. Preston is broke. Thomas is in trouble. Please, Kiana, we need you. I stared at the message. I thought about the sticky note she left on the kitchen island, demanding I scrub her baseboards while they flew on a private jet. I thought about the decades of being told I was not good enough, not bright enough, not loud enough to be the star of her family. They did not want me as a daughter. They wanted me as a human shield to absorb their failures. I tapped the screen. I did not type a long paragraph explaining my pain. I did not demand an apology. I simply typed 3 words, hit send, and blocked her number. I am home. I drove down from my penthouse just as the sun began to break over the Atlanta skyline. I took my time. I wore a tailored emerald green suit that fit like armor and a pair of Christian Louboutin heels that echoed with authority on the hardwood floors. When I arrived at the estate, my team was already waiting. I brought 2 of Obsidian Holdings' top corporate litigators, Attorney Carter and Attorney Sterling. We set up our command center directly in the formal dining room. The formal dining room was Vivian territory. Growing up, we were barely allowed to breathe in this room. The grand mahogany table was reserved exclusively for visiting bishops and high-profile church donors. I took my seat right at the head of the table, exactly where Thomas always sat, to carve the turkey and pass judgment on my life choices. Today, that seat belonged to me. Through the front windows, I watched a battered yellow taxi pull up the long circular driveway. They could not even afford a black car service. The doors swung open and my family spilled out onto the pavement. They looked absolutely ravaged. 36 hours of sleeping in commercial airport terminals, surviving on stale pretzels and begging gate agents for budget standby tickets had completely destroyed their flawless aesthetics. Vivian was clutching her designer tote bag like a flotation device. Her pristine church hair was flattened and frizzy. Chantel was wearing the same wrinkled silk outfit she had broadcasted in 2 days ago, her bare feet shoved into sandals because her heels had blistered her feet. Preston looked like a cornered animal, sweating heavily, his designer shirt untucked and stained. Thomas marched ahead of them, all his face purple with a mixture of exhaustion and volcanic rage. They did not bother knocking. The heavy oak front doors burst open with a loud crash that reverberated through the grand foyer. Kiana Thomas roared, his voice cracking from days of dehydration and screaming at airline employees. "Get out of that guest house right now. You are going to fix this." They marched past the foyer, totally ignoring the stacked moving boxes near the door, making a beeline straight for the back patio. They fully expected to find me cowering in the backyard cottage, ready to drag me out by my hair and force me to unlock their stolen funds. They were so blinded by their own arrogant rage that they did not even glance into the dining room. I took a slow sip of sparkling water from a crystal glass. "You are marching in the wrong direction, Thomas," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the house like a whip. All 4 of them froze instantly. They turned around in unison, their eyes wide with disbelief as they registered the scene before them. There I was, sitting at the absolute head of Vivian's sacred mahogany table. Flanking me on either side were 2 sharply dressed corporate lawyers reviewing thick stacks of legal documents. In the background, a professional moving crew in matching black uniforms was quietly carrying the last few boxes of my personal belongings out of the guest house and stacking them near the front entrance. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at me sitting in her husband's chair, then looked at the lawyers and finally found her voice. "Have you lost your absolute mind?" Vivian shrieked, marching toward the dining room. "Get your shoes off my Persian rug. Get out of your father's chair. Who are these strangers in my house? You have put us through pure hell, Kiana. You are going to call the bank right now and reverse whatever demonic freeze you put on our accounts." Thomas stepped in front of her, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are dealing with forces you do not understand, little girl," he growled. "You think you can steal my church funds and lock me out of my own accounts. I am giving you exactly 3 seconds to hand over the authorization codes, or I am calling the Atlanta police and having you arrested for grand larceny." I did not flinch. I did not move. I just looked at him with a cold, hollow stare. "Go ahead and call them," I challenged, gesturing toward his empty hands. "Dial the police, Thomas." "Oh, wait. You cannot. Your phone plan is linked to the church operational budget, which means your service was suspended at midnight. And Preston cannot lend you his phone because his account was tied to the corporate card of a bankrupt startup. So unless you plan on using a carrier pigeon, I suggest you lower your voice and take a seat." Chantel pushed her way to the front, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly entitlement. She slammed her hands down on the dining table, glaring at me with bloodshot eyes. "You think this is funny?" Chantel screamed, her voice breaking. "You ruined my trip. You humiliated me in front of my entire following. My brand deals are going to drop me. You did this because you have always been a bitter, jealous loser who cannot stand the fact that I have a husband and a life you could never achieve. You dragged my husband into your psychotic little game and embarrassed him." Preston stood right behind Chantel, trying to look intimidating, but his eyes were darting nervously between my lawyers and the thick folders resting on the table. He was a fraud, and he knew that I held the paperwork proving it. "Nobody invited you into the main house," Preston barked, attempting to use his deep, authoritative voice to regain some semblance of control. "You are trespassing on your parents' property. You need to pack up your cheap things and get out of here before things get ugly. We are not playing with you, Kiana." I looked at the four of them standing there, completely unified in their delusion. They had just spent 3 days sleeping on an airport floor because I cut off their funding, yet they still believed they held the power in this room. They still thought they could bully the quiet scapegoat into submission. I slowly stood up from the head of the table. I buttoned the center button of my emerald blazer and looked directly at my sister. "Attorney Carter," I said, not breaking eye contact with Chantel, "please explain to my sister and her husband why they are currently standing in an active corporate staging area." Attorney Carter, a brilliant, sharp-featured black woman who had decimated Fortune 500 CEOs in court, stood up beside me. She adjusted her glasses and looked at my family with the clinical detachment of a surgeon about to make an incision. "Mr. and Mrs. Davis," Attorney Carter stated smoothly. "We represent Obsidian Holdings and its Chief Executive Officer, Ms. Kiana Sterling. We are here today to execute a formal separation of assets and to serve notice of pending criminal litigation regarding multiple instances of financial fraud, embezzlement, and unauthorized diversion of corporate funds." Chantel blinked, her face scrunching up in confusion. "Embezzlement? What are you talking about? I do not work for her fake little company." "You do not work for anyone, Chantel," I said, walking slowly around the edge of the mahogany table until I was standing just a few feet away from her. "You spend your days taking selfies in designer clothes and pretending you run a lifestyle brand. But those clothes cost money. And since your husband has not had an income in 6 months, you got desperate." I picked up a red folder from the table and held it in my hands. "You thought I was just a quiet little data entry clerk," I continued. "You thought I was too stupid to notice when you secretly accessed the minor business accounts I used for my guest house utilities. You thought you could just skim a few $1,000s here and there to buy your Prada bags and pay for Preston's leased Porsche. You thought I would never check the ledgers." Chantel swallowed hard. The aggressive, screaming golden child suddenly looked very small. She glanced back at her mother, then back at me. "I was just borrowing it," Chantel stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "I am your sister. You owe me. You live here for free. It was just a few charges." I slammed the red folder down onto the dining table. The crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. "It was $84,000, Chantel." I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. $84,000 of stolen funds over the course of 9 months. You committed wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. You funded your fake influencer lifestyle by stealing from the sister you publicly mocked on the internet. And I have every single receipt, IP log, and delivery confirmation printed right here in this folder. Vivian gasped, grabbing Thomas's arm. "Kiana, no. You cannot do this to your sister. We can pay you back. We can fix this. You cannot pay for a taxi ride right now, Vivian." I snapped, shutting her down instantly. I looked back at Chantel, whose eyes were welling up with real, terrified tears. "I am not playing the good, quiet sister anymore, Chantel. I am pressing felony charges. You are going to prison." Preston lunged forward, stepping in front of his wife, throwing his hands up in a desperate attempt to play the hero. He was trying to salvage his shattered masculinity in front of my father. "Now wait just a minute," Preston yelled, pointing a finger at me. "You are taking this entirely out of context. Those were complex business loans. Chantel and I were securing capital to keep my tech firm afloat until our next funding round. You misunderstood the financial routing. We are family. You cannot just launch a legal attack because you do not understand high-level corporate finance. I looked at this arrogant, entitled man, trying to gaslight me in my own dining room. I let out a low, dangerous laugh that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. High-level corporate finance, I repeated, stepping directly into his personal space. Let us talk about your corporate finance, Preston. Let us talk about exactly how complex your little business loans really are. Preston opened and closed his mouth repeatedly, struggling to formulate a lie about his corporate loans. He looked at the thick stacks of legal documents resting on the mahogany table, then looked at the two razor-sharp corporate attorneys sitting beside me. The arrogant tech executive persona completely evaporated from his body. He took a slow, physical step backward, creating distance between himself and the reality he could no longer manipulate. Seeing her white knight retreat sent Chantel over the edge. She could not handle the fact that her husband was being humiliated, but more importantly, she could not stomach the cold, unbothered power radiating from me. The narrative she had spent her entire life building was that she was the superior, glamorous golden child, and I was the pathetic, invisible background character. That narrative was currently burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. Chantel shoved Preston out of the way. She charged forward, her bare feet slapping aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She slammed both of her hands down onto the dining table, leaning over the dark wood, until her face was just inches from mine. "You think you are so smart!" Chantel screamed. Her voice was shrill and ragged, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the formal dining room. "You ruined my life. Do you have any idea what you just did to me? My sponsors are already pulling their contracts because of that airport live stream. My brand deals are gone. Everyone in Atlanta is laughing at me. You did this because you have always been a jealous, bitter, lonely woman who could never achieve my level of beauty or secure a wealthy husband. You orchestrated this entire nightmare just to destroy my happiness out of pure spite." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I did not move a single muscle. I just sat in my father's chair and let her scream until her lungs gave out. I let her exhaust her frantic, nervous energy. I watched the sweat bead on her forehead and the ruined makeup smear further down her cheeks. When she finally stopped to gasp for air, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. "Are you quite finished?" I asked softly. Chantel glared at me, her chest heaving, but she did not say another word. I turned my head slightly to the left. "Attorney Carter," I said, keeping my eyes locked entirely on my sister, "please hand me the primary audit file." Attorney Carter reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy red folder. She placed it into my outstretched hand. I looked down at the folder for a brief moment before sliding it smoothly across the polished mahogany table. The heavy cardstock glided across the wood and stopped directly beneath Chantel's trembling hands. "Open it," I commanded. Chantel stared down at the red folder as if it were a loaded weapon. She shook her head, refusing to touch it. "Since your hands seem to be tied, I will summarize it for you," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. 5 years ago, I set up a minor operational bank account. It was a low-tier checking account I used exclusively to pay the utility bills and the landscaping fees for my guest house. I kept it entirely separate from the main estate accounts because I wanted to ensure my finances never touched anything Thomas and Vivian controlled. Because the balances were small and everything was set on automatic payments, I rarely checked the monthly statements. I watched Chantel swallow hard. The aggressive, screaming golden child suddenly looked incredibly small. "About 9 months ago, I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. You came into the guest house uninvited to complain about the Wi-Fi router. I stepped out to take a phone call. You stayed in my living room. You found a piece of mail I had accidentally left on my desk. A bank statement containing the routing and account numbers for that operational fund." "That is a lie," Chantel stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "I never touched your mail." I opened the folder myself, flipping past the summary page to the highlighted bank logs. October 14th, I read aloud. $4,000 at the Prada Boutique in Buckhead. November 2nd, $1,200 at a high-end medical spa for cosmetic injections. December 15th, a massive catering bill for a holiday party you hosted to impress Preston's colleagues. and my personal favorite 3 separate recurring payments of $2,000 to a luxury auto leasing agency to cover the monthly payments for Preston's matte black Porsche. Vivian gasped loudly from the doorway. She grabbed Thomas's arm, her eyes wide with shock. "Kiana, what are you saying?" "I am saying your perfect, glamorous daughter is a common thief," I answered, not breaking eye contact with Chantel. "You linked your personal Apple Pay, your PayPal account, and your credit cards directly to my routing number. You spent your days taking selfies in designer clothes and pretending you were a self-made lifestyle influencer with generational wealth. But you funded that entire fake aesthetic by stealing from the sister you publicly mocked on the internet." I flipped to the final page of the audit. $84,000, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. $84,000 of stolen funds over the course of 9 months. Chantel gripped the edge of the table. Her knees looked like they were about to buckle. She looked back at her mother, then back at me. Her narcissistic defense mechanisms kicked in, desperate to justify the unjustifiable. "I was just borrowing it," Chantel cried out, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. "I am the face of this family. I have an image to maintain. You sit in that guest house doing absolutely nothing. You do not need that kind of money. I was going to pay you back as soon as my brand deals paid out. You owe me anyway. You live here on our property for free. It was just a few charges to keep our family brand afloat." I did not engage with her delusional excuses. I simply leaned back in my chair and gestured toward the woman sitting beside me. "Attorney Carter, would you please explain the legal reality of this situation to my sister?" Attorney Carter stood up, her posture radiating absolute authority. She looked down at Chantel with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. "Mrs. Davis," Attorney Carter stated smoothly, "the actions detailed in this audit go far beyond a family misunderstanding. By willfully and secretly attaching your personal financial profiles to an account belonging to Ms. Sterling and subsequently draining those funds for personal use, you have committed multiple severe offenses." Chantel stared at the lawyer, her mouth hanging open. Specifically, Attorney Carter continued reading from a legal document in her hand. "You have committed identity theft, grand larceny, and because these transactions cross state lines and utilize digital banking networks to purchase goods online, you have committed federal wire fraud." "Federal?" Thomas choked out, stepping forward from the foyer. "Now hold on a minute. We do not need to bring the federal government into a family dispute." "It is no longer a family dispute, Pastor Sterling," Attorney Carter replied sharply. "We have already submitted this comprehensive financial audit to the Atlanta Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. A formal police report was filed at 6 o'clock this morning. An active criminal investigation is currently underway." Chantel let out a piercing, guttural wail. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the Persian rug. The reality of a prison sentence crashed down on her all at once. Her influencer career was dead. Her fake wealth was gone. She was facing a felony conviction that would follow her for the rest of her life. Vivian rushed forward, pushing past Thomas to reach the dining table. She fell to her knees beside Chantel, wrapping her arms around her weeping golden child. Vivian looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and desperation. "Kiana, please," Vivian begged, her voice cracking. "She is your sister. She is your flesh and blood. You cannot send her to prison. We will handle this internally. We will pay you back every single dime she took. Please, I am begging you. Drop the charges." I looked down at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing. "Pay me back with what money, Vivian?" I asked coldly. Vivian froze. "Your personal accounts are frozen," I reminded her. "Thomas's accounts are frozen. The church community fund you rely on is currently under a total financial lockdown, and you are facing an active foreclosure on this very house. I want you to tell me exactly how you plan to manifest $84,000 to save your favorite daughter from a jail cell." Vivian stared at me, the terrifying truth washing over her completely. She had no money. She had no power. The wealth she thought she possessed had always been an illusion propped up by my silent charity. Now that the charity was gone, she was entirely defenseless. Chantel buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the carpet. She begged me not to send her to jail. She cried out for Preston, begging her husband to do something to fix the mess, to save her from the consequences of her own actions. Preston stood in the background, his face pale and sweating. He realized that his wife was going down for felony fraud, and he was the one who had enjoyed the fruits of her stolen labor. The white savior complex flared up inside him one last time. He mistakenly believed he could step in and negotiate his way out of the destruction I had just unleashed. Preston stepped right over his sobbing wife. He did not reach down to comfort Chantel. He did not offer her a hand. He simply adjusted the collar of his wrinkled, sweat-stained linen shirt and cleared his throat. He threw his hands up in a placating, condescending gesture, plastering on the exact same fake diplomatic smile he used to charm my father at Sunday dinners. "Let us dial down the temperature in the room," Preston said, his voice dripping with that unbearable tech industry arrogance. "Kiana, I know you are feeling very emotional right now. You are looking at a few isolated bank statements and taking this entirely out of context. The funds Chantel transferred were not stolen. They were strategic bridge loans. We were temporarily reallocating liquid assets to float my company operations until our Series B funding round closed." I took a step forward, trying to physically loom over me, utilizing his height and his white privilege to command the space. "You are a property manager, Kiana." He continued, his tone dripping with patronizing sympathy. "I do not expect you to understand the complexities of high-level Silicon Valley financial maneuvering. We were securing capital to scale an enterprise software platform. This is complex corporate finance. If you just take a breath and let me explain the venture capital ecosystem, you will see that bringing the police into a simple familial asset transfer is a massive overreaction." I did not back away. I stood my ground at the head of the mahogany table, looking up at this mediocre, entitled man who had spent the last 3 years treating me like the hired help. "Complex corporate finance," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "Let us talk about your complex corporate finance, Preston. Let us talk about the enterprise software platform you claim to be scaling." I turned slightly to my right. "Attorney Sterling," I said, not taking my eyes off Preston. "Hand me the acquisition file." Attorney Sterling, a towering, impeccably dressed man who radiated quiet menace, reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a sleek, matte black folder and placed it squarely in my hand. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the highlighted summary page I had memorized weeks ago. "Your company is called Apex Analytics," I stated, reading his own business name back to him. "You pitched it as a revolutionary data aggregation tool. But the truth is, your code is a bloated, unscalable mess. Your user retention rate dropped by 80% in the fourth quarter of last year. Your burn rate was astronomical because you were paying yourself a mid-six-figure salary while outsourcing your actual development to underpaid interns." Preston stopped smiling. His hands dropped to his sides. "By February, your original angel investors realized you were running a sinking ship." I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "They panicked. They demanded an immediate exit strategy. They were ready to force the company into liquidation and sell your office furniture just to recoup a fraction of their losses. You were begging anyone who would listen for a lifeline. And then miraculously, an anonymous venture capital firm called Vanguard Equity swooped in and bought out all your primary investors. They bought your debt. They kept the lights on." Preston swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "You do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, though the arrogant boom was completely gone from his voice. "Vanguard Equity believes in my vision. They are a massive firm. They see the potential." I snapped the black folder shut. The sharp sound made Chantel flinch on the floor. "Vanguard Equity is a subsidiary of Obsidian Holdings," I said, watching the color completely drain from his face. "I am Vanguard Equity, Preston. When your investors fled, I bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. I bought the 70% equity stake they left behind. You thought some brilliant Silicon Valley titans were backing your genius. You were actually just being propped up by the black woman you forced to park on the street so she would not ruin the view of your leased Porsche." Preston took a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the Persian rug. That is impossible," he breathed, shaking his head. "I am the founder. I am the chief executive officer. I hold the patents. I own the source code. You cannot just buy my company out from under me." "You are not a chief executive officer, Preston," I fired back, raising my voice just enough to rattle the crystal chandelier above us. "You have not been a CEO for months. You are an at-will employee of my subsidiary. And as for your precious source code, you really should have hired competent legal counsel when Vanguard handed you that restructuring agreement. I tossed the black folder onto the dining table. It slid to a halt right next to the red audit file containing his wife's felony charges. You signed a standard intellectual property assignment clause during the buyout. I explained, dismantling him piece by agonizing piece. You were so desperate for the cash injection to keep up your country club appearances that you blindly signed over full rights to the proprietary technology. I own the source code. I own the patents. I own the brand identity. I own every single line of code your interns ever wrote. Preston looked like he was suffocating. He grabbed the edge of the dining table, gasping for air as the illusion of his entire life disintegrated. You cannot do this, he yelled, desperation making his voice crack. You cannot steal my life's work. I will take my team and walk. We will build a new platform from scratch. We will leave you with a hollow shell of a company. I let out a harsh, genuine laugh. What team are you talking about, Preston? Do you mean the 3 lead developers you have not paid a single dime to since April? Because I officially hired them directly under Obsidian Holdings yesterday afternoon. They get full medical benefits, a 20% salary increase, and they do not have to deal with a boss who takes credit for their labor while leaving them to starve. They despise you, by the way. They were more than happy to hand over the administrative passwords. Preston looked wildly around the room. He looked at Chantel, who was staring up at him from the floor with a mixture of horror and disgust. He looked at Vivian, who was clutching her pearls, realizing her ultimate social trophy was actually a completely destitute failure. Finally, Preston turned his panicked eyes to Thomas, desperately hoping the patriarch would step in and save him. But Thomas was glaring at Preston with pure, unadulterated hatred. Thomas had stolen church funds to bail this man out, and Preston had just admitted that the entire company was a sham. You do not have a company, Preston, I said, delivering the final fatal blow. You have a hobby that I funded. You built a house of cards, and you used my money, and my sister's stolen funds, to paint it gold. And as the majority shareholder of Vanguard Equity, I am exercising my legal right to terminate your position effective immediately. You are fired. Preston collapsed into one of the velvet dining chairs, burying his face in his hands. The arrogant, untouchable tech bro was gone, replaced by a broken, unemployed man facing total ruin. He had absolutely nothing left. The destruction of the golden couple was complete. Chantel was facing felony charges, and Preston was stripped of his company, his wealth, and his dignity. The silence in the dining room was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of Chantel's quiet, ragged weeping on the floor. But the battle was not over. Seeing his golden son-in-law destroyed, and his favorite daughter facing prison time, ignited a terrifying, desperate rage inside my father. Thomas could not stand the fact that a woman, let alone his scapegoat daughter, was commanding the room. He could not stomach the loss of his absolute authority. He straightened his tailored jacket, puffed out his chest to its maximum capacity, and stepped forward, his eyes burning with the furious, holy wrath he usually reserved for the pulpit. I was about to try and reclaim his throne. Preston slumped forward into the velvet dining chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The arrogant, untouchable tech executive was completely gone, replaced by a broken, unemployed fraud, facing absolute ruin. Chantel was still weeping loudly on the Persian rug, clutching her mother's ankles, utterly decimated by the reality of her impending felony charges. The silence in the formal dining room was heavy and suffocating, broken only by my sister's ragged gasps for air. Then the sharp, aggressive scrape of expensive leather shoes against the hardwood floor shattered the quiet. Thomas stepped out from the shadows of the arched doorway. He squared his broad shoulders, shooting his cuffs with a violent snapping motion. I was done watching his golden empire dismantle itself, seeing his prized son-in-law destroyed, and his favorite daughter facing a prison sentence ignited a terrifying, desperate rage inside him. Thomas could not stand the fact that a woman, let alone his scapegoat daughter, was commanding the room with absolute authority. He could not stomach the loss of his total control. He puffed out his chest to its maximum capacity, his eyes burning with the furious, holy wrath he usually reserved exclusively for the pulpit. He was ready to bring down the fire of heaven and reclaim his throne. I inhaled deeply, summoning the full resonant baritone that commanded thousands of congregants every Sunday morning. Kiana Renee, he boomed. The sheer volume of his voice rattled the crystal water glasses resting on the mahogany table. He marched forward, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floorboards. You have allowed the devil of arrogance to take root in your spirit. Thomas preached, his voice vibrating with practiced theatrical fury. You sit here in the house I provided, at the table I purchased with the sweat of my brow, and you dare to strike down your own family with venom and spite. You have let worldly money blind you to the eternal judgment of the Almighty. He turned his blazing glare toward Attorney Carter and Attorney Sterling, attempting to extend his patriarchal dominance over my legal team. And you two, Thomas sneered, pointing a thick finger at my lawyers. You sit here enabling the destruction of a Christian household. You are participating in a sin against a man of God. You are helping a bitter, jealous child tear apart her own sister and humiliate a man who tried to elevate this family to new heights. Attorney Carter and Attorney Sterling did not flinch. They sat perfectly still, their posture radiating the kind of impenetrable corporate indifference that money buys. They had faced down corrupt politicians, ruthless hedge fund managers, and hostile corporate takeovers. A screaming megachurch pastor throwing a spiritual temper tantrum in a dining room was nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle to them. Attorney Sterling casually adjusted his gold cufflinks, not even bothering to look up from the legal briefs in front of him. Thomas realized his intimidation tactics were bouncing harmlessly off my legal team, so he whipped his focus entirely back to me. He marched until he was standing just inches away from the opposite end of the dining table, gripping the polished wood with both hands. Honor thy father and thy mother, that your days may be long upon the earth, Thomas shouted, weaponizing the scripture exactly as he had done throughout my entire childhood. Have you forgotten the word, Kiana? Have you forgotten the respect you owe to the man who gave you life? I demand you call off this legal circus right this instant. You will instruct these lawyers to drop these ridiculous fabricated charges against your sister. You will reinstate Preston to his rightful position at his company immediately, and you will drop to your knees right now and beg the Lord for forgiveness for the spiritual warfare you have brought into my sanctuary. I sat perfectly still, observing him with cold, clinical detachment. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead. I watched the veins bulge thick and blue against the sides of his neck. He was performing. It was a flawless, masterful display of psychological manipulation. Growing up, that exact voice terrified me. It was the voice that commanded me to stay in my bedroom and study quietly while Chantel hosted lavish pool parties in the backyard. It was the voice that told me my business degree was a waste of time and money because I lacked the natural charisma and beauty to ever lead a boardroom. He expected me to revert to that scared, invisible little girl. He expected me to shrink, to apologize, to yield to his booming authority. I placed both hands flat on the polished mahogany surface. I pushed my chair back, the sound slicing sharply through the heavy air, and I slowly stood up. I buttoned the center button of my emerald green blazer. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the room. True power does not need to shout. You are confusing spiritual warfare with financial accountability. Thomas, I said, my voice smooth and dangerously level. And you are projecting your own sins onto me because you cannot handle the reflection staring back at you in the mirror. Thomas opened his mouth to shout again, but I cut him off instantly. Do not quote scripture to me while your hands are stained with the money meant for single mothers facing eviction, I stated, stepping away from my chair and moving slowly down the length of the table. Do not preach to me about honoring thy father when that same father embezzled $30,000 from the Church Community Relief Fund just to bail out a fraudulent white tech executive. I stopped walking, standing directly across from him, separated only by a few feet of mahogany. You want to talk about the devil taking root? I challenged him, my eyes locking onto his. The devil did not authorize that wire transfer from the charity account. You did. You chose social status over your own integrity. You chose the illusion of wealth over the very congregation that pays your salary. You sold out your own community just to keep a fake tech bro around to make you look good at the country club. Do not stand in front of me and invoke the name of God to cover up your own financial crimes. Thomas physically recoiled. His mouth opened and closed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was not used to being challenged, let alone thoroughly dismantled by the daughter he had spent 3 decades training to be a silent, obedient shadow. The realization that his holy armor could not protect him from the undeniable facts resting in the red folders on the table sent him into a blind, desperate panic. He slammed his fist down onto the dining table, rattling the paperwork and shaking the crystal water glasses. "I am the head of this family!" Thomas roared, spit flying from his lips as he lost all semblance of pastoral grace. "I am the pastor of Greater Heights Ministries. I am the man who built this legacy from the ground up. I will not stand in my own dining room and be lectured by a disobedient, bitter child who thinks a few lucky investments make her God." He jabbed a thick, trembling finger toward the grand foyer, gesturing violently toward the heavy oak front doors. "You pack up your smug lawyers!" Thomas commanded, his voice echoing frantically off the walls. "You pack up your little red folders, you gather those moving boxes, and you get off my property. Right now. You are banished from this house, Kiana. You are no longer welcome under my roof. You will leave these premises immediately, and you will never set foot in my home again. Get out." I looked at his shaking, outstretched finger. I looked at Vivian, who had stopped comforting Chantel on the floor, and was now looking up at Thomas with a mixture of desperate hope and sheer terror, praying her husband had successfully banished the nightmare. I looked at Preston, who was still hiding his face in his hands, too cowardly to even witness the confrontation. I did not flinch. I smiled. It was a cold, devastating, absolute smile. I reached into the inner pocket of my emerald blazer and pulled out a heavy set of brass keys. I held the heavy brass ring of keys in my hand, letting the cool metal press into my palm. The unmistakable jingle seemed to break the spell that had paralyzed my mother. Seeing those keys the master set to the entire estate, Vivian mistakenly believed I was finally yielding to my father's booming banishment. She thought the sight of Thomas roaring with his chest puffed out had broken my spirit, just like it always did when I was a terrified child trying to hide in my bedroom. Vivian stepped out from behind Thomas, her posture suddenly rigid and towering. The exhaustion of the airport floor vanished from her body, replaced by a sudden venomous surge of adrenaline. She saw me holding the keys and assumed I was preparing to hand them over and walk away in defeat. She wanted to be the one to drive the final nail into my coffin. "Put those keys on the table right now," Vivian demanded, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Your father gave you a direct order, Kiana. You are going to pack whatever cheap, miserable belongings you have left in that guest house, and you are going to get off my property." She marched closer, pointing a manicured fingernail at the polished hardwood floor beneath my feet. "Look at what you have done to my family today," Vivian hissed, her eyes blazing with an ugly, frantic hatred. "Look at the chaos you have brought into my sanctuary. I have spent decades curating this home. I picked out the imported Italian marble in the foyer. I selected the custom crystal chandeliers. I maintained the pristine Persian rugs you are currently standing on. I built a sanctuary of high society elegance, and you have been a dark, embarrassing stain on my perfect image since the day you dropped out of the spotlight." I did not lower my gaze. I did not shrink back. I just watched her unravel. "You never belonged in this house," Vivian continued, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You sit out there in the backyard, bringing zero value to our family name, while Chantel actually does the hard work of elevating our social standing. I was gracious enough to let you breathe the air on my estate because I took pity on you. But I am done offering Christian charity to a bitter, jealous woman who repays my kindness by trying to destroy my golden child. Get out of my beautiful home. Kiana, you do not deserve to stand under my roof for one more second." I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a cold, devastating expression that made the temperature in the formal dining room drop 10 degrees. I stepped forward and opened my hand. I dropped the heavy ring of brass keys directly onto the mahogany table. The metal crashed against the wood with a loud final clatter that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Then I reached for the very last red folder resting near Attorney Carter's elbow. I pushed the thick cardstock across the polished wood. It slid smoothly, stopping right in front of Vivian's trembling hands. "I am absolutely leaving," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the lingering echoes of her screaming fit. "But you have exactly 30 days to follow me." Vivian froze. She stared down at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake, Thomas moved to stand beside her, his chest still heaving from his pastoral temper tantrum, but his eyes were locked on the document. Even Chantel, who was still slumped on the floor, stopped her ragged sobbing to look up at the table. "Open it, mother," I commanded, stripping away any remaining trace of daughterly submission. "Read exactly what is inside." Vivian reached out with shaking fingers. She flipped open the heavy red cover. Inside was a single stack of thick watermarked legal documents bearing the official seal of the Fulton County Property Records Office. I watched her eyes dart across the page. I watched her manicured finger trace the bold black text at the top of the primary document. She read the words "Owner of Record," followed immediately by Obsidian Holdings, LLC. I did not wait for her brain to fully process the legal jargon. I broke it down for her piece by agonizing piece. 3 years ago, when the bank was ready to drag your custom velvet sofas and your crystal chandeliers out onto the front lawn, I stepped in. I explained, pacing slowly along the edge of the dining table. You thought a miraculous anonymous benefactor simply paid off the massive debts Thomas accumulated. But Vanguard Holdings did not just pay off your debt, Vivian. They took full ownership of the collateral. Obsidian Holdings owns Vanguard. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of Obsidian. Vivian let out a choked, breathless gasp. The paperwork slipped from her fingers, scattering across the mahogany surface. Therefore, I stated, bringing the hammer down with absolute precision, I own this estate. I hold the title. I pay the annual property taxes. I pay the premium homeowners association fees. I own the imported Italian marble in the foyer. I own the custom chandeliers. I own the manicured lawn, the swimming pool, and the very hardwood floors you are currently standing on. Thomas grabbed the edge of the table, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. "This is a trick," he stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "This is a fabricated document. We signed a private trust agreement. We never sold the house to you." Attorney Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a look of pure professional disdain. "Pastor Sterling," he said, his deep voice radiating absolute legal authority, "you signed a comprehensive transfer of deed in lieu of foreclosure. You willfully surrendered the property title to the holding company in exchange for the cancellation of your catastrophic debt. The documents were notarized, filed, and legally binding 3 years ago. Ms. Sterling is the sole, undisputed legal owner of this entire multi-million-dollar estate." I turned my attention entirely back to my mother, who was now gripping the back of a dining chair just to keep herself standing. "Let us talk about earning my keep, Vivian," I said, taking a step closer to her. "Let us talk about the sticky notes you loved leaving on my kitchen counter." Her eyes widened with absolute terror. She knew exactly what I was about to say. "Every single time you demanded I scrub the baseboards," I said, my words hitting her like physical blows. "Every time you ordered me to clean the gutters or polish the silver or sweep the patio before Preston's parents arrived from Connecticut. You told me I needed to earn my keep in the guest house. You told your wealthy church friends you were practicing humility by letting your struggling daughter stay out back. You made me park my car on the street so I would not ruin the aesthetic of your driveway." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper. "But every single time I scrubbed those floors, Vivian, I was not earning my keep. I was simply protecting my own investment. I was maintaining my own property while allowing you to live here completely rent-free." Vivian let out a low, whimpering sound. Her legs finally gave out. She collapsed into the dining chair, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer, magnificent irony of the situation was crushing her alive. She had spent 3 years treating the actual owner of the mansion like an unpaid maid. "I did it to save you from homelessness." I continued, showing no mercy. "I bought this house so you would not lose your precious social standing. I bought this house so Thomas would not be fired by the church board and disgraced in front of the entire city. I offered you silent protection, and you repaid my grace with relentless targeted abuse. You left me to scrub your messes while you chartered private jets on my dime to go on vacations without me." Thomas tried to intervene again, desperately grasping at straws. "Kiana, be reasonable," he pleaded, his arrogant pastor persona completely annihilated. "We are your parents. You cannot evict us. We have nowhere to go. My credit is ruined. We do not have any money for a security deposit." I stood tall, looking down at the man who had just tried to banish me from my own property. "You told me to pack my bags and get out of your house, Thomas. I reminded him coldly. You tried to use your patriarchal authority to throw me onto the street. The only problem is your authority is completely fraudulent. You do not have a house. You are a tenant. And as of this morning, your month-to-month courtesy lease has been officially terminated. I pointed to the red folder resting in front of Vivian. The official 30-day eviction notice is attached to the deed. I stated clearly. My management team will be conducting a final walkthrough at the end of the month. If you damage a single fixture or attempt to remove any of the architectural assets that belong to the property, Attorney Sterling will file civil damages against you immediately. Vivian was openly weeping now, rocking back and forth in the dining chair. Her entire identity was tied to this house. Being the mistress of this estate was her only claim to superiority. Without the mansion, she was just an aging broke woman, with a disgraced husband and a felon for a daughter. We are flesh and blood, Vivian sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand toward me. Please, Kiana, do not take my home away. We will do better. We will change. You are our daughter. I looked at her outstretched hand and felt absolutely nothing. The well of forgiveness had dried up completely. You did not care that I was your daughter when you posted that picture on Instagram, I replied. You did not care about flesh and blood when you laughed about leaving the dead weight behind. You made your choices very clear, Vivian. Now you get to live with the consequences. The ultimate shift in power was absolute. I was no longer the quiet girl taking up space in the guest house. I was the landlord, the benefactor, and the executioner of their false reality. They were sitting in my formal dining room, breathing my air entirely at my mercy, and I had absolutely none left to give. Thomas stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. The reality of the eviction notice rested heavily on the mahogany table between us, but his narcissistic mind simply refused to process the defeat. He tightened his jaw and attempted to summon the last remaining shreds of his pastoral authority. He puffed out his chest, smoothing the lapels of his wrinkled linen suit, desperately trying to project the image of a man still firmly in control of his kingdom. You think a piece of paper frightens me? Thomas sneered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, menacing pitch. I am the senior pastor of Greater Heights Ministries. I have a congregation of 10,000 loyal members who hang on my every word. I have a board of elders who will deploy the best legal defense team in this state to protect their shepherd. You cannot evict a man of God from his own sanctuary. The church will cover my expenses. The church will protect my reputation. When I stand at the pulpit this Sunday and tell my flock that my own daughter has been corrupted by greed and corporate malice, they will rally behind me. You will be the one ostracized from this community forever. I did not flinch at his booming threats. I simply looked at Attorney Sterling, who offered a brief clinical nod of confirmation. I turned my attention back to the arrogant man standing across the dining table. You are incredibly predictable, Thomas. I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. You always rely on the loyalty of the people you are actively deceiving. You truly believe your charisma can outrun a forensic audit. But you are forgetting one critical detail about the corporate structure of your beloved megachurch. I took a slow step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The Community Development Fund was the primary financial pillar, keeping Greater Heights Ministries from declaring bankruptcy 2 years ago, I explained, watching his eyes narrow with suspicion. As the sole anonymous benefactor of that fund, my holding company required absolute financial transparency. We installed mandatory compliance protocols to ensure the charitable donations were not being misappropriated. When you sat in that commercial airport terminal and attempted to wire $12,000 of charity money to buy yourself a first-class flight home, you did not just freeze the accounts. You triggered a mandatory automated compliance breach report. Thomas stopped breathing, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. As a licensed fiduciary, I am legally obligated to report any confirmed embezzlement of charitable funds to the governing board of directors, I stated clearly. I do not hide the truth to protect toxic family members. I protect my investments. Exactly 1 hour ago, a certified corporate courier arrived at the private residence of Deacon Rollins. Vivian let out a sharp, terrified gasp from her chair. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning completely white. The courier delivered a comprehensive, unredacted financial dossier directly to the chairman of your board. I continued dismantling his entire sanctuary piece by agonizing piece. The dossier included the bank logs showing the $30,000 wire transfer you sent to Preston to fund a bankrupt tech company. It included the receipts for the custom-tailored suits you fraudulently expensed as youth outreach materials. It included the steep bills for luxury steakhouses you disguised as pastoral counseling sessions. I paused, letting the devastating reality wash over the formal dining room. And most importantly, I added my tone, dropping to a lethal whisper. The dossier included a certified copy of the deed to this exact estate. I sent the church board undeniable proof that their wealthy, successful, prosperous pastor has not actually owned his own home for 3 years. I proved to them that you are a financial liability who has been secretly living on the charity of the very daughter you publicly humiliate. Thomas staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He grabbed the back of a dining chair to steady himself, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The absolute certainty of his religious empire vanished in an instant. He knew exactly how the board of elders operated. They tolerated his arrogance only because he brought in substantial revenue and projected an image of divine financial favor. A pastor who steals from single mothers to fund a white tech executive is a liability. A pastor who lies about owning his own home is a fraud. "You rind me!" Thomas choked out his voice, cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. "You destroyed my life's work. You destroyed my name. You destroyed your own name the second you decided your ego was more important than your integrity." I fired back effortlessly. I simply turned on the lights so everyone else could see the rot. Suddenly, bright beams of white light sliced through the darkness outside. The heavy, sweeping illumination washed through the tall custom windows of the formal dining room, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. The distinct crunch of heavy tires rolling over the crushed gravel driveway echoed loudly through the quiet house. Multiple vehicles were pulling up to the front entrance. I looked out the window, then looked back at my parents. "It seems the Board of Elders reviews their courier deliveries very promptly," I noted, checking the gold watch on my wrist. Thomas spun around to face the windows. Through the sheer drapes, the silhouettes of 3 large black luxury sedans were clearly visible. Car doors began opening and closing with heavy, authoritative thuds. The muffled, serious voices of several older men drifted across the manicured lawn. Thomas recognized the vehicles instantly. It was Deacon Rollins, Elder Peterson, and the rest of the Executive Church Committee. They had not waited until Sunday morning. They had driven straight to the estate under the cover of night to demand his immediate resignation and strip him of his pastoral credentials before the embezzlement became a public scandal. Vivian let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a guttural, soul-tearing wail of absolute despair. She scrambled up from her dining chair, her eyes wide and frantic. She looked down at her wrinkled, travel-stained clothes. She touched her flat, frizzy hair. For decades, Vivian had ruled the congregation with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. She was the untouchable First Lady of Greater Heights Ministries. She sat in the front pew wearing imported silk hats and passed brutal, silent judgment on the outfits and lives of every other woman in the sanctuary. Her entire self-worth, her entire identity was predicated on being superior to everyone else in her social circle. She thrived on the envy of her peers. Now those same peers were marching up her driveway to strip her of her crown. The women who used to kiss the hem of her garment would soon be gossiping about her in hair salons and grocery stores across Atlanta. They would know she was broke. They would know she was a tenant living on my charity. The humiliation was absolute, total, and inescapable. Vivian stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick fabric of the Persian rug. She lost her balance entirely. She collapsed heavily onto the floor, landing right next to Chantel, who was still weeping silently in the shadow of the table. "No, no, no," Vivian sobbed, curling into herself on the hardwood floor. She gripped the fabric of her skirt with white-knuckled intensity. "I cannot let them see me like this. Tell them to go away, Thomas. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. I cannot lose my church. I am the First Lady. I am the First Lady." She repeated the title over and over again like a broken record, rocking back and forth on the floor, her pristine, highly curated socialite image dissolved right in front of my eyes. The armor of respectability she wore to abuse and belittle me for my entire life was permanently annihilated. She was reduced to a weeping, trembling mess on the ground of a house she did not own. Preston backed away into the farthest corner of the dining room, pressing his shoulders against the wall, trying to make himself completely invisible. I was a coward who had happily exploited our family resources, but the second real consequences arrived at the front door. He refused to stand and fight. The heavy brass knocker on the front double doors echoed loudly through the grand foyer. The sound was sharp, demanding, and final. Thomas stood frozen in the center of the room. The man who always had a booming sermon prepared for every occasion was entirely speechless. He looked at the front doors, then looked back at me, his eyes begging for a lifeline that he did not deserve and would never receive. I stood tall at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by my brilliant corporate attorneys. My posture was flawless. My spirit was entirely at peace. I looked down at my weeping mother and my paralyzed father. "I believe your guests are waiting at the door, Thomas," I said, gesturing gracefully toward the foyer. "You should really go greet them. After all, it is incredibly rude to keep the people firing you waiting on the porch." The heavy brass knocker pounded against the front doors again, the sound echoing through the grand foyer like a judge striking a gavel. Thomas stood completely paralyzed, the color drained from his face, his broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The booming, untouchable patriarch of Greater Heights Ministries was entirely dismantled, reduced to a terrified man waiting for his public execution. On the floor beside the mahogany table, Vivian finally broke. The reality of the church board standing on the porch, waiting to strip her of her title, her social standing, and her entire identity shattered whatever fragile delusion she had left. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive silk skirt dragging across the Persian rug. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands and grabbed the hem of my emerald green blazer. "Kiana, please," Vivian sobbed, her voice a ragged, breathless plea that tore from the back of her throat. "I am your mother. I carried you. I gave you life. You cannot let them do this to us. You cannot let them take my church and my home. We are flesh and blood. You have to protect your family." I looked down at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely invisible. I looked at the hands clutching my jacket, the same hands that had written countless sticky notes, demanding I scrub her floors, the same hands that had packed a luxury suitcase for a private jet while leaving me behind in an empty house. I did not step away. I simply looked at her with a cold, hollow detachment that finally made her realize the depth of what she had destroyed. "If we had known you owned everything," Vivian cried out, the tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "If you had just told us you were the benefactor, we would have treated you differently. We would have given you the respect you deserve. We would have never left you behind. Please, Kiana, just give us another chance to show you." The dining room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Even Chantel stopped her hysterical weeping to listen. Attorney Carter and Attorney Sterling stood perfectly still beside me, their faces hardened into masks of professional disgust. Vivian had just confessed to the ugliest truth of our entire family dynamic, and she was too blinded by her own panic to even realize what she had said. I reached down and gently but firmly peeled her trembling fingers off my blazer. "That is exactly the point, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. "You just said it out loud. If you knew I had money, you would have treated me like a human being. You only respect power. You only respect wealth. You never respected me." Vivian let out a sharp, devastated gasp, her hands falling limply to her sides. "You did not want a daughter," I continued, looking directly into her wide, terrified eyes. "You wanted a prop. You wanted an audience for your fake perfection. You wanted a scapegoat to absorb all the bitterness and insecurity you could not hide behind your expensive church hats. You spent my entire life teaching me that my value was conditional, that my presence was a burden, and that my success only mattered if you could use it to elevate your own status." I stepped back, putting physical distance between myself and the wreckage of my family. "Well, you taught me a very valuable lesson, Vivian," I stated clearly. "You taught me how to recognize a bad investment, and I am officially divesting from this family." I turned my back on her weeping form. I looked at Attorney Carter and Attorney Sterling, giving them a single decisive nod. We walked together toward the grand foyer, our footsteps synchronized and echoing with absolute finality. Thomas did not try to stop me, Preston did not utter a single word. Chantel remained curled on the floor, weeping over the ashes of her fraudulent life. I reached the heavy oak front doors and grasped the brass handle. I pulled the doors wide open, revealing Deacon Rollins and the 5 senior members of the church executive board standing on the porch. Their faces were grim, their postures rigid with righteous anger. They held thick leather portfolios containing the exact financial dossiers I had provided. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly polite. "Pastor Thomas is waiting for you in the formal dining room. I believe you have some urgent business to discuss." Deacon Rollins removed his hat, offering me a solemn, respectful nod. "Thank you for your transparency, Ms. Sterling. The board appreciates your integrity in bringing this to light. Have a blessed night." I stepped off the porch and walked down the crushed gravel driveway toward my waiting car. I did not look back at the sprawling brick mansion. I did not look back at the manicured lawns or the towering oak trees. I got into the back seat of my vehicle, the doors locking with a solid, comforting click, and I drove away into the Atlanta night, leaving them entirely to the consequences of their own making. The fallout was swift, absolute, and completely devoid of mercy. In the weeks that followed, the natural consequences of their toxic arrogance descended upon them like a relentless storm. Chantel faced the full, crushing weight of the legal system. The felony fraud and embezzlement charges were airtight, supported by irrefutable digital evidence and bank logs. To avoid a lengthy prison sentence, she was forced to accept a brutal plea deal. She received 5 years of strict probation, hundreds of hours of community service, and a mandatory restitution order that garnished her wages until every single stolen dime was repaid. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to her social annihilation. Preston completely abandoned her. The moment the white savior tech executive realized his free ride was over and that his own fraudulent business practices were exposed, he filed for divorce. He packed his remaining clothes, boarded a budget flight back to Connecticut, and moved into his parents' basement, dodging the massive civil lawsuits filed by his former investors. Chantel was left entirely alone, saddled with criminal debt and stripped of the lavish lifestyle she had built her entire identity around. With no brand deals, no wealthy husband, and no family trust, to siphon from the golden child was forced to enter the actual workforce. She secured a minimum wage retail job at a discount beauty supply store in a rundown strip mall. The harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the retail floor were a brutal contrast to the soft ring lights she used to broadcast her fake perfection. Her uniform was a cheap polyester polo shirt. Atlanta is a very connected city, and the internet never forgets. Former followers and gossiping church members frequently recognized her ringing up hair extensions and fake lashes. They took discreet photos. They whispered in the aisles. The woman who once bragged about generational wealth from the back of a luxury SUV was now forced to ask her former peers if they wanted to sign up for a store rewards card. Thomas experienced a corporate execution masquerading as a religious transition. The church board did not offer him a graceful exit. Confronted with undeniable proof of his embezzlement, tax fraud, and misuse of charitable funds, they stripped him of his pastoral credentials overnight. They forced him to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a public letter of immediate resignation, citing vague health reasons, effectively banishing him from the pulpit. He lost his 6-figure salary, his housing allowance, and his esteemed pension, driven by his massive ego. Thomas attempted to start a new independent ministry in a rented storefront on the outskirts of the city. He printed cheap flyers and stood on street corners trying to recruit a new flock. But the whispers of his financial crimes had already poisoned the well. On his opening Sunday, he stood behind a flimsy wooden podium and preached to an empty room containing exactly 12 folding chairs. No one showed up. The charismatic king had lost his crown, and without his captive audience, he was just a tired, broke old man shouting into the void. But Vivian experienced the most agonizing downfall of them all. The eviction was executed precisely on the 30th day. With her husband disgraced and her daughter a convicted felon, her carefully curated socialite circle dropped her completely. The wealthy churchwives who used to compliment her designer hats stopped returning her phone calls. They crossed the street when they saw her coming. She was utterly ostracized from the high society she had sacrificed her own daughter to impress. Vivian and Thomas were forced to move into a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment in a noisy, poorly maintained complex. The walls were thin, the carpet smelled of stale cigarette smoke, and the kitchen had cheap laminate countertops that peeled at the edges. Every day, Vivian had to wake up in a space that reflected her actual reality. She had no maids, no landscapers, and no scapegoat daughter to scrub her floors. She was forced to face the grueling reality of being poor, isolated, and entirely irrelevant. While they drowned in the shallow waters of their own creation, I continued to rise. 6 months after that defining Labor Day weekend, I walked into the newly expanded headquarters of Obsidian Holdings. The environment was a breathtaking contrast to the heavy toxic energy of the estate I had left behind. The offices were flooded with bright, natural sunlight pouring through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The walls showcased vibrant, original artwork by local Black artists. The air hummed with the sound of brilliant, driven women collaborating, negotiating, and building wealth on their own terms. I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, exchanging warm smiles and genuine greetings with my team. Zuri, my brilliant chief financial officer, was reviewing a multi-million-dollar acquisition brief with a quiet, razor-sharp focus. Jasmine, my lead legal counsel, was laughing brightly while finalizing a commercial real estate contract. These women were my chosen family. We did not demand perfection from each other. We demanded excellence, but we offered absolute grace. We uplifted one another. We protected each other's peace. There was no petty competition, no gaslighting, and no conditional love. We were a fortress of Black girl magic, thriving in a corporate world that constantly underestimated us. I stepped into my expansive corner office and closed the door. The soundproofing instantly enveloped me in a cocoon of absolute tranquility. I walked over to the windows and looked out over the sprawling, dynamic Atlanta skyline. The city stretched out before me, pulsing with life and endless opportunity. I pressed my hand against the cool glass and took a deep, cleansing breath. For 33 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I had shrunk myself to make them comfortable. I had hidden my brilliance to protect their fragile egos. I had allowed them to convince me that I was a secondary character in my own life. But looking out over the empire I had built with my own hands, my own intellect, and my own unyielding resilience, I realized the ultimate truth. Healing is not about demanding an apology from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Healing is about reclaiming your own narrative. It is about severing the toxic bloodlines that drain your spirit and having the courage to build your own table when you are denied a seat at theirs. I was no longer the hidden scapegoat scrubbing baseboards in the shadows. I was the architect of my own destiny. I was the undisputed queen of my empire, and my crown was finally permanently secured. This story teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth and the immense courage required to establish boundaries with toxic family members. We often condition ourselves to accept disrespect from the people closest to us because we confuse shared blood with genuine love and loyalty. This journey illustrates that true empowerment arrives when you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. By quietly building independence and refusing to react emotionally to deliberate provocation, one can reclaim their power and rewrite their own narrative. The ultimate takeaway is that your true value is never defined by how poorly broken people decide to treat you. Tell me in the comments below, have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and sanity?